They never taught us what happened to the daughters of Rome. They named the emperors, praised the conquests, built statues for the sons. But the daughters, those born to kings, consuls, and patrician fathers, were written out, bled out, or locked away in silence. Some were never named at all. Beneath the marble, behind the silk curtains, Rome kept a secret history, not of war, but of inheritance, not of power, but of control. And it began, as it always does, with a room no one was supposed to find. They were digging beneath the Palatine Hill when they found it. Not a tomb, not a shrine, something else. The chamber was sealed behind a false wall of travertine, almost perfectly hidden in the curve of an old wine passage. At first glance, it looked like nothing at all. A small room with no windows, no exits, only a sunken bed carved into the stone itself. But the marks told a different story. Chains once fixed to the corners of the slab, scratches in the wall, all shallow and frantic. A handful of letters repeated like prayer, L, V, A, over and over until the stone thinned. No scrolls were inside, no name above the door. The prefect ordered the chamber resealed before sunset. He told the workers to forget it, but one man didn't. A young scribe named Marius stole a single parchment hidden in the mortar, damp, curling at the edges, but legible still. It was not a royal document, nor a decree. It was a confession, or perhaps a warning. It read, "She was the fourth daughter, the first to bleed, the last to be remembered." The writing was hurried, but the seal was unmistakable. The wolf-suckling twins, the imperial mark. Marius kept the scroll in his sleeve as he walked the long way home. That night, he did not sleep. He began to copy it by hand, tracing the letters slowly as if afraid the act alone might summon someone. He paused only once, when the parchment mentioned the law of silence, that some daughters were never registered at birth, never named aloud, so that no rival could marry them and no record could ever prove their existence. It was a legal erasure, perfected over generations. And beneath it all, the logic of Rome, that what is not written does not exist. The scroll ended without a signature, only a final phrase etched with what looked like blood: "Do not seal the wall again." She is still listening. Marius burned the original before dawn, but the copy remained. It would be read by one man, then another, until it reached you. If you're reading this now, remember, Rome was not built by men alone, but it buried its daughters with greater care than any of its kings. In the earliest years of Rome, before marble coated the temples and laurels crowned the emperors, the firstborn daughter was not a gift but a calculation. Among the noble families, she was seen as a risk wrapped in silk, too weak to inherit, too strong to be left free. Fathers watched their infant daughters not with love, but with caution. They were born into silence, but silence was not safety. A law, unwritten but understood, whispered through the halls of the patricians: the first daughter belongs to the house. Before suitors were considered, before a dowry was measured, the father decided. Sometimes she was locked in the west wing of the domus, far from the eyes of guests. Sometimes she was raised as a servant under another name, while a younger sister, prettier, quieter, more useful, was presented as the true daughter. In darker cases, she never left the room she was born in. A physician's record from the time of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus makes a strange note: infant healthy, mother weeping. The girl will be kept for ritual. The word ritual recurs often, but it rarely meant religion. It meant control, a process to cleanse the family of future threats. Roman superstition mingled with politics, and the result was cruel. Some fathers believed that the power of their lineage would rot if the firstborn daughter fell in love on her own terms. A consul named Severus publicly executed the man his daughter kissed beneath an olive tree. She was not punished, but she was never seen again. Later records list only his sons. That was how they did it, quietly, efficiently. No need for scandal when paper can forget. Mothers were often complicit, trained from girlhood to believe that obedience was a virtue and sacrifice a necessity. They whispered to their daughters, "You must be invisible to survive." A noblewoman named Aurelia was said to have birthed 4 daughters. Only one was ever recorded. A household slave later confessed, under torture, that the other 3 were kept in a marble cellar with a single oil lamp and taught to walk without sound. The girl who made noise had her tongue pressed with a hot coin. When the emperor visited the house one winter, he dined above them, toasted their health, never heard a thing. Rome was built on order, and order demanded that daughters never complicate the future. So they erased them not with knives, but with law. A father's will could declare his daughter ex familia, with no explanation. Once removed, she no longer existed in any ledger, temple, or census. Her body might still breathe, but legally, she was ash. In a city obsessed with permanence, there was no fate more terrifying, because the daughters weren't just forgotten, they were never meant to be remembered. The Temple of Vesta was a place of purity, they said, a sacred space where fire never died and Rome's future was guarded by untouched women. But purity in Rome was never protection. It was a cage, and the girls chosen to enter it were not always chosen by the gods. Behind every Vestal virgin was a father with ambition, a family with secrets, or a crime that needed atoning. To the crowds, the selection seemed divine, childhood innocence wrapped in white robes, lifted from the ordinary into reverence. But many of those girls were firstborn daughters, offered not out of devotion but desperation. A daughter declared a Vestal could not marry, bear children, or claim inheritance. She was, for 30 years, a legal ghost. Her silence suited her family well. Some fathers sent their daughters to the temple after rumors spread of love letters found, of meetings in gardens, of the kind of innocence that could not be restored. One scroll speaks of a senator's daughter who bled too early. Her mother begged for mercy. The father shaved the girl's head, wrapped her in linen, and delivered her to the Vestals that very night. She was 8, but others were not so fortunate. Those deemed unworthy of the temple were tested in darker ways. A physician named Callias, whose notes were preserved in mold-stained wax tablets, described a practice he called proof of bloom. Girls of high status were examined for fertility discreetly, brutally by midwives sworn to secrecy. If fertile, they were sent to bear children for political gain, often impregnated by chosen men whose names were never recorded. These births happened in country villas, far from Rome. The daughters returned thinner, quieter, sometimes mute. The infants vanished. Rome explained it as illness. One girl, Liciniia, was said to have given birth in chains after refusing the chosen man. Her child was taken and raised as the heir of a barren cousin. She returned to the city with new scars and a new name. In the records of her house, the line simply says, Liciniia went north for her education. No mention of the child. No mention of the birth, because in Rome, a daughter's body did not belong to her. It belonged to the house, and the house answered only to itself. For the men, these acts were not cruelty but strategy. A daughter's womb could secure alliances, test bloodlines, or cleanse suspicion. And the daughters? They were taught to smile, to speak only when summoned, and to believe that suffering was sacred. The punishment for breaking Vesta's vows was burial alive. But the truth was, many of these girls had been buried long before, under duty, under silence, under the weight of fathers who called it love. When Rome went to war, it did not only send men, it sent daughters, not to fight, but to vanish, sacrificed not with swords but with veils and vows. In the name of diplomacy, girls barely past childhood were handed to enemy kings, rival chieftains, and distant governors, their bodies offered like coin for peace. It was called marriage, but no ceremony could disguise what it was, a quiet surrender of blood to prevent bloodshed. Fathers spoke of duty, mothers wept in silence. The daughters, dressed in gold, boarded ships they would never return from. One girl, Domitia of the Aurelii, was sent to Parthia at 13. Her dowry included a white horse, a silver idol of Minerva, and a sealed letter promising allegiance. 2 months after her arrival, the Parthian prince was killed by his brother. Domitia was burned with him on his funeral pyre. Rome never claimed her body. Instead, a statue was built in her honor, placed in a public garden, and praised as a symbol of Roman grace. Her name was carved beneath it, but the inscription listed no date of death, as if she had never died at all. In rare moments, the sacrifice was even more direct. During the reign of Emperor Tiberius, a failed harvest led to whispered fears of divine anger. The Sibylline books were consulted, and a grim decision was made. A noble daughter would be offered to Pluto in secret rites. The girl was taken from her bed before dawn, dressed in bridal robes, and led blindfolded beneath the Capitoline Hill. The ritual was recorded by only one man, a disgraced augur who later hanged himself in a brothel. His notes, retrieved by his apprentice, describe a room of stone and ash, an altar slick with oil, and the girl's final words, "I was never allowed to live. Let them at least remember how I died." They did not. Her name was erased from all records. Her family was awarded a new estate. Years later, their second daughter was married into the imperial line. The girl was never mentioned again. This was how Rome endured, by devouring its own daughters and calling it patriotism. The citizens cheered parades of generals, never knowing the treaty they celebrated had been sealed with a girl's pulse. The senators toasted to stability, never acknowledging the tomb hidden beneath their feet. Sacrifice was expected of all Romans, but for daughters, it came early, and it came often. They were born into families that measured loyalty in silence, and honor in how well they disappeared. Sometimes they were remembered in songs, but more often they were not remembered at all, because Rome needed peace, and peace, like everything else in the empire, had a price. She wore gold at her throat, not for beauty, but to mark her as ruined. That was the term whispered behind fans and under breath when a noble daughter was declared unfit for marriage. Ruined. Sometimes it meant she had spoken too freely. Sometimes it meant she had been touched by a cousin, by a guard, by her own father. Whatever the reason, once marked, she could not be wed into power. But Rome, always pragmatic, found another use. These daughters were given to men who could never claim them, loyal soldiers, foreign slaves, eunuchs, or guards of low birth. The arrangement was not spoken of publicly. The law called it concubinage, but it was closer to sentencing. These girls, now women, were renamed, relocated, and buried in private wings of the domus or in countryside estates no one visited. The gold collar was not always literal, but the effect was the same. They were owned. A record from the reign of Augustus lists a shipment of fine linens, figs, and 3 silent girls for the southern villa. Their ages were not included. Their fathers' names were. There are poems, soft, sad things buried in the margins of darker texts that speak of these daughters. One describes a girl with ink-stained fingers, locked in a tower with only scrolls for company. Another tells of a woman who bore 3 sons for a guard who never spoke to her. All the boys were taken at birth, trained in secret, then adopted into distant households with invented names. Rome's noble lines were crafted with more fiction than fact. Bloodlines were guarded, yes, but also bent. A barren wife's child might be her husband's daughter's son. The truth was sealed in wax and never spoken aloud. Even the gods played their part. Statues of Juno Lucina, goddess of childbirth, were placed in the halls where these women lived. Offerings were left. Prayers were said. But no names were carved. In one villa outside Tibur, a grave was found beneath the floor of the master's library. The bones were small, female, and wrapped in silk. No markings, no cause of death. Only a single bronze bracelet remained, etched with a word, Domita. The house records make no mention of any Domita. Yet the gardener remembered a girl with dark eyes who used to hum when she thought no one was listening. He said she vanished in the winter of the emperor's illness. That same winter, the estate was rewarded with new land, because even in silence, daughters could serve. They were vessels, sacrifices, and solutions so long as they stayed hidden, and if they spoke, Rome had always been skilled at teaching its women how to stop. They said she had gone north for her studies. That was the phrase her father used at dinner parties, a thin-lipped smile masking the silence that followed. But the truth was heavier than words, locked beneath the cellars of their estate where sunlight never reached. She had once been called Tullia, firstborn of a wealthy magistrate, praised for her calm demeanor and flawless Latin. But when her belly began to swell, no husband had been named, no marriage announced. Whispers grew teeth. Her father acted swiftly. He told the slaves to clear the wine barrels from the lowest vault, ordered chains affixed to the stone walls, and brought the midwife in secret. Tullia gave birth alone, her wrists bound, her hair matted with sweat and dirt. The baby was a boy. His eyes opened before he cried. Wrapped in royal linen and taken within the hour, he was never placed in her arms. The midwife refused to say where he went. When she screamed, her tongue was pressed with a coin pulled from the fire, a punishment meant to discourage further noise. From that night forward, she never spoke again. What happened to Tullia was not rare. When noble daughters bore children out of order, or from men of the wrong blood, they became liabilities. But killing them outright risked divine wrath and public scandal. So Rome did what it always did. It rewrote the truth. Tullia's name was reassigned to a male cousin 2 years her junior. Her clothes were burned. Her painted bust, once meant for the family corridor, was quietly broken and buried in the garden soil. Her bedchamber became a guest room. In the estate's ledgers, she was listed as deceased due to fever. But she was very much alive, breathing in the damp dark, tracing invisible lines on the wall with her fingernails until they bled. A house slave claimed he saw her once, years later, in a cart headed toward a convent in the mountains. Her hair had gone white, though she could not have been more than 20. She held no child, only a scrap of cloth with a red thread sewn into its hem. Perhaps it had been the boy's, or perhaps it was all she had left of a name that no longer belonged to her. Some say she died there. Others believe she lived on under a different name, cared for by nuns who never asked questions. But even in death, Tullia remained erased. Her tombstone was simple, placed in a corner of the family plot where moss grew thickest. It read, "Obedient daughter, loyal until silence. No dates, no surname." Just a stone reminder of what Rome expected from its daughters. Not virtue, not joy, only disappearance. They called them madwomen, witches, traitors. But those who knew better called them something else, the remembered. They were not many, and they did not walk in daylight. They moved between shadows and side doors, slipping into kitchens, tending to berths in back rooms, hiding in the folds of silence Rome had created. Some had once been noble daughters themselves. Others were midwives who had seen too much, slaves who had listened too closely, mothers who had watched their daughters be led away and never return. They were the ones who remembered the names that had been erased. They carved them into the backs of bronze mirrors with sharpened hairpins. They stitched them into the hems of mourning robes in threads so fine it looked like dust. They hid them in songs taught to young girls, disguised as lullabies, each line a record of who had lived and what had been taken. They moved carefully because memory in Rome was dangerous. A woman who remembered too much could be accused of anything: poisoning, sorcery, disloyalty. It was easier to call her mad and lock her away than to listen, and so the remembered learned to whisper. One known only as Calvia, the name found burned into the corner of a worn veil, was said to have sheltered dozens of escaped daughters in her cellar beneath a bakery. She taught them to walk without sound, to fake a stillborn cry, to smile when asked if they missed their families. A senator's daughter, believed dead from fever, lived with her for 3 years, posing as a mute apprentice. Her father remarried without ever asking where the body had gone. Another girl, small and pale with a scar above her eye, claimed to have been raised in a tower until the age of 12, fed through a slot in the door. When she was found, she did not know how to speak her own name. The remembered gave her a new one, stitched into a linen ribbon she wore around her wrist, Laelia. No records of these women exist in the Senate archives, the temple registries, or the family trees of Rome's noble houses. But their names are whispered still, passed from woman to woman in corners of markets, behind funeral processions, within the flicker of oil lamps at dusk. Rome did not fear curses, it feared memory, because memory was the only thing that could unravel the lie of a perfect lineage. And these women, with their needles and scraps of thread, were archivists of the forbidden. They did not raise armies or start revolts. They did something quieter and more dangerous. They remembered. The scroll was supposed to burn. That was the order. When the chamber beneath the Palatine was discovered, the prefect demanded silence. and silence meant fire. One by one, the contents were thrown into the brazier: broken hair combs, scraps of linen, wooden tablets too warped to read. But one scroll, brittle and black-edged, refused to catch. The flames licked its corners, hissed at its ink, but it would not vanish. The scribe, Marius, took it as a sign, or perhaps a curse. He wrapped it in his tunic and walked home as if nothing had changed, though everything had. That night, he unrolled it on his desk. The writing was uneven, hurried, written in different hands, some careful, some frantic, some barely legible through what looked like smears of blood. It was not a single voice but a chorus, fragments of girls who had lived, died, and been buried without name or prayer. One described being locked in a shrine, mistaken for a statue. Another spoke of giving birth in a room full of mirrors so she would not forget what her body had become. A third ended her entry mid-sentence, as if someone had come for her before the ink had dried. The last was written in red, not ink but dye, maybe wine or something worse. It read, "They said we were ashes, but we were embers." Below the line was a seal unfamiliar, yet unmistakably imperial. A she-wolf, not with two boys, but with a girl at her breast. Marius knew what it meant. Somewhere, someone had remembered, someone had kept record, and someone had hoped that one day someone else would read it. He did not sleep. When morning came, he copied it by hand. Then again, in a second version meant to look like a myth coded in metaphor, wrapped in parable. He placed the real one behind a loose stone in the wall, the false one in the library where it would survive under the name of poetry. Days later, the prefect returned. The chamber was resealed. The scroll, they believed, was gone. History remained untouched. But Marius had already begun writing again, not scrolls this time, but letters. He sent them quietly to far provinces, to old priestesses, to midwives he had once ignored. Each letter carried a single line: "Do you remember the daughters?" Some were never answered. Others returned with tokens: a lock of hair, a name carved on bone, a prayer written backward. Years passed. Rome changed. Emperors fell. Fires came. But the scrolls survived, passed in silence, hidden in the corners of temples and beneath floorboards. Today, you read them not as law, not as history, but as inheritance. Because what Rome tried to silence still lives in the breath between pages, in the corners of your own blood. The daughters were never truly gone. They were only waiting to be read. If the story of Rome's daughters haunted you, remember, some truths are buried so deep that only the brave dare to unearth them. Comment the oldest building or ruin in your country, and if you want more forgotten histories that whisper long after the page is closed, like and subscribe to Forgotten Stories Ancient World.